Hi.
Hi, everyone. Whoa is right. This is such a lovely crowd. Thank you all so much for coming out and spending your Tuesday evening with us. We really appreciate it. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. So we are so excited to have Claire Dederer and Brandon Taylor with us tonight to celebrate the launch of Claire's newest work of nonfiction, Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma. Before we get into all of that, though, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First off, mask wearing is optional but encouraged at tonight's event. If you'd like a mask, we have some extras up at the front register where you checked in. We'll have time for an audience Q&A towards the end of tonight's discussion. There are note cards on all of your chairs and a few pens dispersed around, so please feel free to write a question down on those note cards at any point during the conversation. We will then collect those and try to get through as many as we can. After the talk tonight, Claire will be signing and personalizing books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to line up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Monsters online using the link in the live stream description. All right, let's get into this. There is truly so much to say and discuss about this book. It's a little bit daunting to try to introduce it. So I'm just going to open with the final sentences from Alexandra Jacobs' review in the New York Times. This is a book that looks boldly down the cliff at the roiling waters below and jumps right in, splashes around playfully, isn't afraid to get wet. How refreshing. And a quick note, Monsters will be featured on this week's cover of the New York Times Book Review. So that's very exciting too. Claire Dederer is the author of Love and Trouble and the New York Times bestselling memoir, Poser, My Life in 23 Yoga Poses. A book critic, essayist, and reporter, Claire is a longtime contributor to the New York Times. She lives near Seattle with her family. And as I mentioned earlier, Brandon Taylor joins Claire in conversation tonight. Brandon is the author of the novel Real Life, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, and the story collection Filthy Animals, a national bestseller and winner of the Story Prize. All right, that is all from me. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Claire and Brandon.
Hi, everybody. I have coerced Claire into reading a short reading from her brilliant book, Monsters. So without further ado, Claire.
I'm going to keep patting you. Thank you for being here. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. This is really an incredible collection of people. There's a lot of amazing writers in this room and a lot of people who've helped me so much, from my very first book to helping me with this book, the Knopf team and my family, and so many friends and people from my writing group. So people who've blurbed the book. I have so much gratitude to everyone here, and thank you for coming out. It's just, this is really like an old home week. Now that I'm out here looking at you all, it's just incredible. So thank you. I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, and I'll just set a little context. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm going to set a little context. The book opens, I'm in the middle of working on my previous book, Love and Trouble, which is a memoir about growing up in the sexually predatory era of the 1970s and 80s, and about my own experience as a girl during that era. And the book has a lot of like formal experimentation and different ways it goes about its business. And one of the things it does is, one of the aspects of it is there's an open letter to Roman Polanski, who I do not know, although the book is a memoir. So in support, in aid of writing that, I researched Polanski's life, and I researched his crime. I read the deposition of the girl who he raped, the 13-year-old, and was convicted of raping. And I found, to my surprise, and maybe even a little bit of horror, I found I could still watch the films. I loved them. I had started as a film critic, and he was pretty much my favorite director. And so giving up Rosemary's Baby or Repulsion didn't seem like something I wanted to do. And this was in 2014 or 2015. So I've been a writer for a long time, and I thought, well, this is an interesting problem. And I started to make notes on it and think about it. I'd spent my life being disappointed by beloved male artists. John Lennon beat his first wife. T.S. Eliot was an anti-Semite. Lou Reed has been accused of abuse, racism, and anti-Semitism. These offenses are so unimaginative aside from everything else. I didn't want to compile a catalog of monsters. After all, wasn't the history of art simply already that? I had a dawning realization. I was trying to find out not about the artists, but about the audience. Polanski had become not his own problem, but my problem. I had a glimmer of a thought. I wanted to write an autobiography of the audience. Such a book was a little mysterious to contemplate. It would take place where exactly? Inside my head? Within my living room as I read or watched television? In my car as I listened to music? In a theater or a museum or a rock club? Suddenly all these humdrum locations seemed like sites of drama. If I were writing an honest autobiography of the audience, I mean the audience of the work of monstrous men, that autobiography would need to balance these two elements, the greatness of the work and the terribleness of the crime. I wished someone would invent an online calculator. The user would enter the name of the artist, whereupon the calculator would assess the heinousness of the crime versus the greatness of the art and spit out a verdict. You could or could not consume the work of this artist. A calculator is unthinkable, yet our moral sense must be made to come into balance with our art love. I wanted for there to be a universal balance, a universal answer, though I suspected maybe that balance is different for everyone. A friend who was gang raped in high school says that any and all work by artists who've exploited and abused women should be destroyed. A gay friend whose adolescence was redeemed by art says that art and artist must be separated entirely. It's possible that both these people are right. We don't always love who or what we're supposed to love. Woody Allen himself famously quoted Emily Dickinson. This is when he's talking about his relationship with Sun Yi. The heart wants what it wants. I will say my editor shut down my idea to title the book The Heart Wants What It Wants. I am very strongly. Auden said, W.H. Auden said it more nicely, as he said almost everything more nicely. The desires of the heart are as crooked as corkscrews. The desires of the audience's heart are as crooked as corkscrews. We continue to love what we ought to hate. We can't seem to turn the love off. I'll stop there. Ooh.
I mean, now I kind of wish you would leak the convo where you guys are going over
I think that's pretty much it.
whether to call. I mean, I want to know more. Maybe we should call them up here so we can litigate this.
Right.
Thank you for that reading, Claire. Thank you for this book. My first question is, what is a monster?
That's such a good question.
And what is monstrousness, and what appeals to you about the idea of monsters?
All right, well, so the word monster it came to the fore in two separate ways. One is, I had been writing this book for maybe a year or two before there was the online kind of eruption of Me Too, right? So Me Too existed as a movement, but the online, sort of Me Too moment came in October of 2017. And in that moment, the word monster began to be used within kind of the discourse about what was happening. The word monster kind of was extra textual, like it wasn't something that was in my book yet, but it became the kind of go-to catch-all phrase to describe what somebody at another event called jerks, which is, both excellent. Yeah, it's an interesting word. So I started to think about the word then. I started to use it and it felt funny, but I continued to use it. It felt overstated. It felt a little bit too strong and too kind of othering. But I was also interested in how the idea intersected with the idea of the art monster from Jenny Offel's book, Department of Speculation. Show of hands for who's read it.
Oh, so good.
A lot of people. That's her editor is here, so that's nice for her to see. The book was really important to me, and the idea was really something that kind of took hold of my brain and the brain of a lot of artists. I mean, I'll say female artists and writers, but I think a lot of just artists and writers. And she was bringing up this idea that you know, the art monster is the person who gets to just think about making art. They don't have to think about anything else. So she talks about Nabokov. You know, he didn't have to do anything. Vera licked his stamps for him. And as I say in the book, I hate licking stamps, right? Like, I love to have someone do that. So there was a kind of expansion of the word monster in a different direction that was really interesting to me. But it wasn't long before that started to seem like a problem, the word monster.
I'm curious also about the word monster and what you just mentioned, the sort of otheringness of it. And I'm curious if for you, in writing this book, you came to the idea perhaps that monster is an ethical and moral category of thing, or that it comes with some attached moral or ethical vector, like a thing that we must do to this category of person.
Right. It's spurring an action.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think that what I eventually came to realize was that what I really meant was a person whose biography disrupts or complicates our experience of the work, which is a much more elastic and broad idea. And once I sort of realized that's what I was writing about, suddenly that word kind of became more of a problem. And yes, somebody who maybe whose actions spur some kind of maybe collective reaction.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the different sorts of monsters you talk about in the book. One of my favorite, though, was Nabokov as a kind of anti-monster.
Oh, yeah, that was a bit of a surprise for people.
Could you talk a bit about the anti-monster?
Yeah, okay, well, so, you know, in some ways that's my favorite chapter in the book. People have really strong feelings about Lolita. You might not know that. And I wanted to look at a piece of art that is about monstrousness, but where we have no evidence of sort of a biography of monstrousness in its maker. And the way that we sort of, it's almost the reverse action. So the book itself is about, you know, you have the artist and you have the biography, and the book is about the way the knowledge of the biography stains the artist. But you have the reverse action happening with Lolita, where the book itself stains Nabokov. And in fact, when I spent a lot of time with the text and I reread it for like God knows how many times. I mean, I'm sure you read it a lot.
No, like only twice. And that was too much.
Why was it too much?
Well, it's a very intense book. And I feel like part of its intensity is that Nabokov, as an artist, one of his magic tricks is a kind of moral suspension, where he's just like in Humbert, and he's just taking you through the universe from Humbert's like moral positionality. And I find that really beautiful as an artist, but like as a human being, it's a lot to experience.
Yeah, but I think your work does that.
Oh, that's bold if true.
I mean, I think that there's moral complexity in your characters in that way, that where as readers we're trying to figure out the moral stance of some of your characters. And I think that you put that on the reader a little bit.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's Trilling's idea of moral realism, but I feel like the thing that my characters, like the readers having to like watch them say a meme cutting thing at a dinner party, whereas with Nabokov, it's like the most brutal, horrifying thing imaginable.
Well, true, but sometimes there's other things they're doing. Okay, we don't need to get into it. But there is a way sometimes their behaviors are emblematic of a horrific complacency, perhaps.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one thing that we're talking about here is that sort of discomfort in the reader, where the reader perhaps in watching a character like Humbert do the horrible thing, is it sort of creates that almost call to action in the reader that they want to do something to set the universe right in some sense. And I'm curious if you feel that that's what's playing out when the biography stains the work, perhaps, that like when the reader or the viewer or the person engaging the art finds out the horrible thing, it creates a concomitant like call to action that makes them want to like rectify perhaps something. That's why we want justice and we want to see the monsters destroyed.
Right. I'm sort of going back to thinking about how Lolita affects the reader and whether they want to kind of participate in the righting of the wrong. And I'm thinking about, there's a line I talk about where Martin Amis, he talks about Lolita as a metaphor for the Shoah, which is pretty shocking. But I think what he's getting at is this idea of the numberless silent victims. And I think that one thing that's so horrifying about Lolita is that a call to action is absolutely refused, because what he's asserting, what Nabokov is asserting, is the universality of the crime. So in the ordinariness of the crime. So unless you go into every single person's home, you'll never fix it, right? Anyway, that's just working through what you're saying. So, but it is interesting. I like what you're saying about, I feel like you're almost talking about biography as a text that spurs us to action. So one of the ideas I really deal with in the book is this notion of this new role that biography plays in our lives, right? And that we are constantly engaging with biography. We can't escape it. And, I'm 56. When I was a kid, it was really actually very hard to know anything about the artists you love. It wasn't just that you could avoid knowing whatever the piece of information you don't want to know about Woody Allen or R. Kelly or whatever. But it was actually hard to find biographical information. And I remember when I was in freshman in college, I got a biography of Deanne Arbus, and I was like, oh my God, I can know things about this woman. It just seemed wild to me. I guess that's just, encountering biography, but it was, it was not such a common thing, and it was something you had to work to do. And so, people have asked me, why this book, why now? And it's like, well, because I just finished it, but also because we are in this moment in history where our relationship to biography has so radically altered within my lifetime. And our experience now is that there is no escape. Biography is always with us. It's almost like a sickness. It's the air we breathe. It's falling on our heads. We can't get away from it. And our biographies work the same way. We have this economy that generates untold billions of dollars that's basically fueled by biography, ours, and then the biographies of famous people or people of interest, or who even knows what a famous person is anymore. So how we navigate, so we are confronted with the biography whether we want to be or not. And then there's this really interesting dynamic of biography as text. Like, I have come to know this text, and now what do I do? There's a call to action, and yet, is there a correct action? How would we agree? There's all this ambiguity that immediately comes up.
Yeah, I love what you say about biography being a kind of like airborne toxic event. And it does feel true. I sort of jokingly said in response to one of the millions of like biographical catastrophes happening on Twitter the other day, like, we should know less about other people. I just think we should know less. We should know so much less. It would soothe me tremendously. But I also think part of that wanting to know less is in part like a desire to flee from the discomfort that, this book is tackling, right? Which is, what do you do when the art that you love at your deepest core, was created by someone monstrous, and not just created by them, but seemed to emanate from the very thing, like in the case of Woody Allen and Roman Polanski.
Right. And yes, to all of that, I think that is the dynamic. It's been really interesting. I just sort of had this revelation a few days ago that I have always thought of this book as a description. I've always thought of it as something that looks at what is happening when these two things come into conflict. So on the one hand, and it only really matters when sort of two conditions are met. And the one condition has to be some really truly disruptive biographical fact. But then the other part that we don't talk about as much, the other condition that's required is love of the work, is that the work be something we care deeply about. So when those two things meet, and no, that's so me, I'm so bossy. That I don't, to me, I think often this question gets framed as the kind of absolute horribleness of the crime up against this sort of absolute, sort of authorized idea of the greatness of the work. And that is a problem for me. I think that who gets to decide what work is great? Who, if we're going to sort of try to balance these two things, first of all, my experience of the crime, my subjective experience might be very different from yours or from someone else, depending on who I am, my history, my culture, all that stuff that holds me in a place and time. So I have a specific relationship to the crime. And then I also, how do I decide what work is important to someone else? Then we're getting into like kind of questions about canon and what we're supposed to love versus what is meaningful and important to people. Maybe someone, you know, who danced to Michael Jackson at their wedding has a totally different relationship to the work than I have. And if I start to say that we're going to create these canons of work that can be justified to keep, so to speak, which is a word that keeps coming up, in the face of the crime, it's like, okay, let's go all the way, and like, who's going to make that decision? Because I have a pretty good sense of who it's going to be, and I don't think they're going to have the same list I do. So those are the two things that are in play. And my idea of the book has always been what's the description of the emotional, the ethical, almost even the physical landscape of what's happening in that moment. And to me, that is a more literary project. I think description versus prescription kind of falls into that category for me. And I think that's how it's always just sort of occupied my brain. And I've been thinking a lot about this book. First made its appearance in the world in the form of an essay that was in the Paris Review in 2017 called "What Do We Do with the Art of Monstrous Men?" And I think that title, putting that title in the form of that question that suggests there's an answer, it was a great title. Like, it's been ripped off a lot since then. And I'm really grateful for that title. That I think it's a slight, in terms of the book, it becomes a slight misframing. Like, I've even misframed it to myself. Like, well, what are we going to do? Right? And I do sort of land toward the end, and I'm not going to scoop it, but I do have some thoughts, but that's not even really that's not what's animating the book. Yeah. It's more like, what is actually happening when you're trying to watch Bill Cosby? Or what is it, you know, those kinds of questions, getting at the sort of set of assumptions, the bending to authority, the returning to your own feelings and subjectivity. That's more interesting to me. That's a long way of saying I'm not going to answer your question.
No, I love that answer. That's a brilliant answer. To me, listening to you talk about it, to me it sounds like your goal was to describe the tension between these two regimes of value, like the value of art and the value of one's, you know, the sort of value of like honoring the crime that was committed or the deed that was done by these horrible monsters. And it does sometimes feel like daily we're watching it play out at like hyper speed on social media and in our newspapers of record, where it does feel like we're in this constant battle for like the soul of the contemporary life between these two regimes of like, no, that person's a monster, they did this horrible thing, versus, but like, I really like that song is so good.
Right. Yeah, I think that well, I'm sorry to keep dragging your work into this, but this idea of, I think buried in that is this idea of what is public and what is private, right? So our relationship to these questions of identifying with the victims or consuming the art, you know, those used to be things that you would never conceive of as public acts, right? It's just unthinkable. It just isn't part of your experience. But now that's very much part of how we move through the world. Yeah. The identification is performed in an effort to legitimize the accuser's words. And then at the same time, the lifting up of the art is also performed. So I think that that's something that is a dynamic that is also new. And I wonder, one of the things I'm wondering about more as I'm out on the hustings talking to people is about privacy as a refuge. Like, what if we took some of these dynamics between what you're describing? I think we need to speak up. And I think when people speak up and say something shitty happened to me, we listen,
Right.
right? Like, but in terms of how we navigate, we as consumers, which is a complicated idea, as we navigate it, can we find a little more, I'm gonna say some hippie words, peace and space to just be in our own dynamic with these things. And the book is really a call in many ways to a reaffirmation of the primacy of subjectivity, and that people are coming to these questions truly with their own experience. And we hear a lot about the biography of the artist, but we kind of forget that the audience member is coming with their own biography, and these two things are meeting. And then sometimes they're exploding outward in a public way. But maybe there can be that, Viktor Frankl-esque moment to reflect.
I think that you literalize that within the text. There are all these like really great moments. Text. Is this a grad student seminar?
Exactly.
You did a great job of literalizing that theme.
Thanks. Was it in the text?
Yes, it was great. Both metatextual and paratextual. But no, I there are these moments where you're arguing with yourself, where you're not only self-implicating, but like self-inquiring. There are moments where you're like, why did I ask that question? Or like, I said we, but I meant I. I tricked you, didn't I? And I love that. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about this book as a system of inquiry and also a self-implicating, self-questioning, vis-a-vis like centering subjectivity.
Yes, I love that. Very good question.
Thank you, Claire.
There's actually sort of the political charge of the book to me comes from a couple different places, but the strongest one is this kind of raising of subjectivity that I experienced as a reader when I read Pearl Clegg's essay Mad at Miles, and she was writing about her relationship to Miles Davis and how mad he made her. And I loved that a feeling was just right there in the title. So she's writing about both her subjective hatred of Miles and his own self-admitted abuses, but also her love of the work and the way that work wove, like music does, into the dailiness of her life. I mean, music has a really special status because it lives alongside us and comes to define eras of our lives. And so as I was working on the book, I came upon this essay, and she resided so unapologetically in her subjectivity that it allowed me to think about my role as a critic, as a person, all of these things. It made me reapproach the problem more kind of settled in my own, like, okay, this is my own perspective is enough, and I'm going to have to do the incredibly risky thing for a writer and a critic of just allowing my perspective to be enough. So that was very scary. Part of the process that was kind of scary was just, I want to talk about subjectivity and I want to model it in the work. So I'm really glad you caught that. And I'm going to sort of get that from Pearl Clegg, and then kind of my objective will then be to pass it to the reader, right? That you come away sort of then questioning your own subjective relationship to work that's important to you. Because the book, again, is not a catalog. I don't go through and be like, yes, no, no, yes. I instead take you through my thought processes and my, discomfort. So that was kind of the root of the subjective nature of the book. And then I really wanted it to be reflected in the structure of the book. It was really important to me that we include scene. That felt incredibly important, that you could know who I was and where I was coming from. I did have an early outline that was a drawing of a creek, and then there were boulders in it. And the boulders were going to be the scenes, and the creek was the flow of thought. And I mean, that didn't work. So my brilliant editor helped me kind of go back on a more straightforward path. So I did include scene as a way to emphasize what you're talking about. But then the kind of questions, the self-questioning, and the way the narrator is constantly kind of asking herself, is that it? Is that it? Is that it? I thought that was really important to bring the reader into that experience. And also, somebody said to me another writer said to me really early in the process, you just have to sort of, your voice is going to lead the reader through this. And so, well, my voice is a questioning voice. So I decided to just go with it. And use it to underpin my point. But I also had a really, really dark moment about 2 years into writing the book, I was, I was trying to write as honest a book as possible, and that did involve a lot of like wobbling and sort of Buster Keaton back and forth thing. And I started to think, am I just afraid of the internet? Am I just not coming down on one side or another, or kind of doing this constant like recursive second guessing because I'm worried that if I make an assertion, the internet's gonna eat me alive? And is there something that's more black and white that I want to be saying? And I was able to really, sit with that idea for quite a long time, and realized that no, this is really what my approach to the work is. This is how I feel. This is honest. And if I were to start to make these really strong assertions, I would actually be allowing the internet to distort the book, through me pushing it, meeting its needs. And so I then kind of returned to that voice you're talking about. And then it was a question of about a year of just looking at every sentence and thinking, do I really think that?
I know that feeling well.
Do you?
I recently went through it myself. I'd like to ask you a bit about female monsters, lady monsters, if you will. I think like you're writing about what makes a woman a monster, I think is like some of the most provocative writing in the book.
Yeah. It's like people are annoyed.
And I kept like raising my eyebrows, being like, oh, she is going for it. Oh my, I can't wait to see how this turns out. You make some spicy statements, which I think all books should contain.
Absolutely.
But I'd love to just hear you talk about what makes a woman a monster.
So,
or not do. Yes.
And actually, the book really, in many ways, doesn't actually deal with what makes a woman a monster. It's more what makes a woman experience the state of worrying she's a monster, is more what it's about. So, because I am a memoirist, I think anytime I'm writing about something, even if it's a work of criticism, especially a book like this, where there's so much sort of pointing outward at that guy, right? Like at a certain point, it's gonna point back at me. So about halfway through the book, I go to the question, am I a monster? And there's several different ways that this question gets answered, but the kind of central one has to do with the idea of women who abandon their children. And this idea that sort of the signal male crime is rape for several reasons, and the signal female crime is the failure to nurture. And, it's a very kind of, I'm really trusting the reader, because obviously it is like, someone jerking off in a potted plant in front of their underling is very, is much worse than somebody who goes to her job. But so there's a lot of trust of the reader to go with me as I explore this. And what I'm really looking at is the experience of internalizing this feeling that there's something wrong with me if I'm focusing on my art and not on my job as a nurturer. And I take Doris Lessing and Joni Mitchell as sort of almost these parable figures of women who left children behind and went on to do their work. They're great work. I mean, they actually are geniuses, unlike some other geniuses I could name. So what do their lives mean? What can I learn from them? And in a weird way, there's the book is dealing with the idea that there's something wrong with them because they've done this. And it's almost as though my narrator is like, well, I want to learn that something wrong. Like, how can I be more like that? And I think that I've been thinking a lot about the focus on the tension between mother and artist in the book. And I think that it's really important, and there's a lot of books talking about this right now. It's kind of something that's sort of emerging into a dialogue. And I think that the reason the conversation about the mother and the artist is so important is that it's really a conversation about who does care and who gets to sort of practice the sacred self-work of the artist. And that's a sort of, that should be an everyone question. I don't think it is an everyone question, but in my ideal world, it would be much more of an everyone question, right? And so I think that the mother question with this tension between taking care of other people and making her art doesn't get solved internally. It gets solved when we stop having like very narrow gender essentialist ideas of who gets to do care and who is in charge of doing care, and thereby the mother artist can have more help.
Yeah.
Like, seems good, right?
Free healthcare, and daycare, and childcare,
All
and
those
maternity
things.
leave.
And the book right takes this turn into
Yeah.
just like full communism. Yeah.
I mean, it does increasingly seem like the answer to many of life's woes and questions. So there's that degree of like woman monstrousness, mother monstrousness, but there's also, you also talk about Valerie Solanas. And violence and crimes.
Yeah. Is there a question?
Yes, please talk about the violence. Just talk about crimes.
So the book, I deal with the idea of two artists whose acts really disrupt their texts. Valerie Solanas, and I pair her with Sylvia Plath, and I partly just did it to be annoying. Like I just, part of it was just to sort of put things in different categories and get you to look at them differently. But these are two people who cannot be uncoupled from their action, right? One of them is a very great artist. One of them is not, but has written a book, and the book is defined strangely by her act. And so I'm just trying to get at the way their violence, their rage affects the way we read their work, and the way that they're both of their book worlds. I'm really trying not to say text now. It's both of
Just go for it.
In their writing, both of them have created worlds that in some way are free of men, but in their lives they were both like felt themselves to be and were deeply oppressed by men. So there's this way in which I'm looking at the tension between those two things. That's all that's really going on there.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that's all that's going on there.
Well,
There's
tell me
also
more. What else is going on?
Something else that's like really sly about that part of the book is that you kind of turn this question of you turn this question of like, or you revisit the question of how does biography impact the reading. And to me it really speaks to a lot of what you're getting at in that Nabokov chapter, which is the relationship between biography and art. And you come to this really gorgeous point in that Plath section, especially where you talk about, we act as though there is a right way to read, and I read that as like to read a life as well as to read literature. And that to me feels like the heart or the core question of the book, right? Which is like, what is the right way to read or to engage in this art, with the question of biography.
Yeah, I love that. You're literally the only person who has seized upon that passage, and I feel that it's the core passage of the book.
I agree.
It's very hidden away. It's actually a passage in which I'm being sort of cranky with a poet and critic named Ruth Padel, and it's like not Ruth Padel's fault, but she talks about how there's sort of good readers of Plath and bad readers of Plath. And the good readers of Plath are, read the way poets read, in this sort of empty meadow where they're encountering the poems. And the wrong readers of Plath are the readers who come to her through her biography. And I thought, I am that wrong reader. I came to, think of a girl who reads, it feels sad, goes to read the bell jar, reads the bell jar, comes through the bell jar, ends up reading the poems, and then eventually makes her way through, kind of almost through Plath's biography, out the other side, and then is finally in that field Padel's describing with the poems, right? Like you can be there sometimes, but it's not wrong to have it be disrupted by the biography. So kind of my little argument with her in my mind was something that I wrote very early in the book, and there's some ways in which, I'm sorry to say, the whole book is built around that passage, and you found it.
Wow! How thrilling! Yeah. Wow, I'm so thrilled to hear that. I mean, I loved that passage because, to me, it just cracked the whole book right open. Because I was like, oh yeah, I keep losing my paper because oh my god. Don't want to have you do labor while we're you're doing enough, Claire. You're doing enough. But it did feel truly like we were dealing with this question of what is the right way?
Right.
What is the right way? And in the end, it's like, whatever way you come to it, homie.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, once we start telling each other, I've already said that. Yeah. I'll just wait.
Ooh. I have a question. What do you think of Saul Bellow and his biography. He had 5 wives. He had a child at 87 years old. Pretty wild guy. In Ravelsey, he talks about the trail ridings on the rim of the Grand Canyon with the motorcycle. I mean, and the Blue Zachary biography, which is 2 pages, which writes every book as an autobiography. The guy is totally wild. The guy won a Nobel Prize in '75 for Herzog. He's more than Roman Polanski. This guy is a piece of work. What do you think of him and his work?
I mean, I love Saul Bella's work. I don't know. I don't actually feel like it's my job to weigh in on each person's biography. I'll be honest with you. But if I did that, I could be doing that for the rest of my life.
Polanski and Woody Allen and someone like Is Monstrousness. These guys are totally messed up. Wonderful writers. How do you see them in view all the other authors who you're analyzing?
I don't see them. I don't know. I have no idea, but thank you for that wonderful question. We have another one here for you. Thinking about how monster comes from a root meaning to show. It's very visual. Can you speak to some of the tension surrounding the art monster in terms of visibility and whether the audience must shift into being a witness? Oh, I like that question. That's a very good question.
That is a good question.
Thank you.
Say that one more time, just that last bit.
And whether the audience must shift into being a witness.
Yeah, I think that idea of the audience as a witness goes back to that idea I was talking about of public and private. And I like that image because it's almost like a Greek chorus kind of situation. It's very cool. I think that the audience can almost become a mistaken witness. I was talking to a really interesting young writer a couple weeks ago, and she was saying that there's a way the audience can witness, in the text of the biography, the victim, and then they want to do this kind of expression of support of the victim, that becomes their role, just as this person is saying. And that she was saying she felt like it was a feeling of solidarity, but I think we've all encountered this idea in the expression of solidarity. Sometimes you can lose the impetus to do something. Which I thought was really interesting. So witness, yes, and I think that this is like one of the ideas that gets lost when we start to rely on phrases like cancel culture. It's like, okay, let's back up, and somebody's saying something terrible happened. Let's listen, let's figure out what's going on here. But then what happens next, witnessing isn't necessarily enough.
Often not. Although I do feel sometimes that in our witnessing, the opposite happens, which is that we lose our executive function or our evaluative function, and we cease to be able to think also.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of the book is dealing with that idea that we want to think that when we're confronted with the story of the witness that we're, like I say, making an ethical decision about what to do, but so often we're in this morass of feeling. And that's fine, right? Like that's part of the kind of our job is to describe what feelings are like, and it's okay to be coming to respond to the material through feeling, but not to get it mixed up with ethics, right? They're not the same thing.
Yeah, and I feel like you're often doing that in this book where you're like, oops, that was a feeling, not a thought. Got you again. The way that you troll.
Someone's personal life and their right to have a personal wild life.
Perhaps you can write that on a note card. We have a protocol. It's okay. We're all good.
That's nice. It's nice to have a protocol.
This is juicy. What? Woo. What if you are a woman who abandons her children and you are not a genius?
Exactly. This is the question.
Does that make you more of a monster than a woman who creates masterpieces and abandons her children?
Yes. This is such a great question. I love it. Is this you, Ruthie? Nice. I was talking with another writer about this and about the feeling that if you made something good enough, it would be okay to have gone to work. And so there's this way in which this feeling that, you know, you're not a genius keeps driving you to make something better, right? So that you can retroactively justify having gone out to the shed in the backyard, right? And that's fine. Like, I mean, there are a lot of writers in this room, and people write for a lot of really terrible reasons, right? You know, I've always said that your first book comes from the spirit of vindication. But now that I'm older, I think all books kind of come out for a desire for vindication.
So true.
Thank you. So I think that like pushing yourself to improve and be better so that you can then retroactively have been a genius all along. Like, sure, fine, do that. Yes. So I guess maybe I'm treating this question as a process or craft question, right?
I also, it makes me think about Nora from A Doll's House. And she, you know, she's not like an artist in the traditional sense, but like she's just a lady. She's just like a lady
Right,
who
she's just a lady who wants to go.
she wants to go, and like that's enough. Right? Like self-determination is enough, according to Ibsen.
Yeah.
I recently found out that he stole that from the life. Do you know this?
No.
Okay, so there was like a writer, I forget her name, Laura something perhaps. She would later become like one of Denmark's like most beloved authors, but she was a writer. She was having a moment, a crisis in her life, and she wrote to her good friend Henrik, and she's like, "My husband is really ill. I need you to like, you know, can you guarantee a loan for me so that I can help him?" And Henrik's like, "No, I really don't think that's not a good time for me right now." And so she forged a signature, and she got caught, and it was a big scandal. And you know, her husband was like, "Oh, no, this won't do." He divorced her and then had her committed to an asylum. And she's like, "Whoa." And then she gets out, and then 5 years later, he's like, "Actually, I really can't handle the kids. Will you please come back?"
Nice.
And then Henrik Ibsen's like, "Man, I really should have helped her with that loan. Instead, I'll write a play about her."
Steal his best.
And I was like, maybe Ibsen's in part 2.
Right, there will be nothing.
But yes, I love to be able to give you a tale.
I love a tale.
To compensate. So we got a great question here. Claire, I can't remember exactly how you put it. Is it ethical facts versus moral feelings?
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear you talk about the subjectivity versus objectivity, its relationship to facts versus feelings, and to gender. Where do those axes fall along the exploration of who is monstrous and what acts we call monstrous?
Well, I mean, that's kind of the book. Let me do my best. I think that there is a chapter of the book that's really crucial to what you're talking about that has to do with writing criticism. And in that chapter, I'm trying to get at what we were talking about earlier about the ways in which authority gets established so that we can decide what work is going to get a pass when someone does something terrible. So I guess I've thought about this more in terms of establishing the greatness of the work, because I do feel that the badness of the crime is it's so slippery. I mean, it's just something that is sort of waxes and wanes, and I feel like the greatness of the work is where people try to kind of plant a flag and say, this is so good, it deserves to be consumed no matter what. And I'm interested in the ways that traditionally criticism has been written by people who are similar to the work under discussion. So, you know, you have the dominant, you know, the most work, you know, so much work being made by, and I hate to say these words, but by white men, and then being reviewed by white men. And then there's this channel that's passing between these two people in which subjectivity becomes invisible, right? Both these people are in no way central. They have all their own history, their own ethnicity, their own culture, their own economic circumstances, but they're invisible because one person, they're so similar to each other that it never becomes disrupted. But when you're outside that channel and you speak up, it's like, well, that's a woman's point of view. That's a subjective point of view. Or it can be all, you know, from any angle. And so I that is how I feel gender affects it.
Yeah, yes. brilliantly said, Claire, as usual.
Thank you. And
One more, but unfortunately we only have time for one more.
So I have to choose.
Yes.
Mine, it's really good.
Which one is yours?
It's about our angels.
Oh yeah, okay. I
Oh.
like this one. Art angels, is there a possibility to make exuberant, gorgeous art and have a rad fucking biography? Do you have any art angels you love?
I have some art angels I hate.
Let's get into it.
I think there are certain people who become what I think of as art saints.
Yeah.
Who do you think they are?
Well, I'm not saying that. There's extreme and cancel culture is real.
right. Yeah, maybe we'll just describe them.
Like, yeah.
And it is interesting. I am very nervous to say them.
What if we don't
No, it's.
There's a live stream.
I do think that there's a handful of artists who come to represent certain qualities, and they tend to often share certain aspects. They regardless of their work, they tend to be thin white women of a certain age who represent rebellion in a very readable form. And there's a way that they create a permission for rebellion in the viewer or reader, and they come to represent the art saint. So, setting that aside, that's a very uncomfortable thought. I have very strong feelings about it. Can you make exuberant work and have a rad biography? Absolutely. I'm sure it's the case for every single person in this room. I mean, there are people whose lives I look at and I feel inspired by, certainly by their work and their life. I mean, those people certainly exist. And again, subjective, it's going to be different for everyone. But I also, this is sort of not answering your question, but I think it's a nice thought to end on, or a nice reflection, is I went last week to meet a bunch of undergrads at the Art Institute of Chicago. And they were art students. They were not humanities students. They were kids who are trying to have a studio practice. And they were also taking a class on this subject. And they were like 19 or 20. They were young, and they were very earnest, and it made me feel so much happier to be alive to talk to them. It was really great. And they were looking at this problem in a slightly different way. They were looking at lives of the artists in order to learn how they ought to be. And even more than that, they were having a problem, and their problem was a problem with entitlement. They were having a problem feeling entitled to be artists. You know, and there are all different kinds of kids in the room trying to do all different kinds of things, but they all were really struggling with making yourself into an artist. And there was some rage there, like, okay, you finally became a great artist, and then you fuck it up by blowing it, by being cruel to someone. But it was really interesting to look at the problem through someone trying to have a practice. And at the end of the dialogue, one of them shared the news that R. Kelly has been making music from prison, which I hadn't known. And it was, the kids' response to this was fascinating. They were like, oh, he's still an artist. And they were sort of internalizing that, this sort of different way of processing. He's horrible, he's done the worst possible thing, he's been convicted of it. But they were also looking at the core identity of him as an artist. And it's actually one of the most complex moments I've had around this problem. So I don't know if it answers your question. But it was very moving.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you, Claire. That's amazing.
All right, let's all give it up. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you all for asking questions. Thank you, Brandon, for moderating such a fascinating conversation, of course. Thank you to Claire for celebrating this fantastic launch.
Thank you for having me. It's amazing.
Yeah, so a few quick reminders. If you're still with us on the dreaded live stream, you can purchase a copy of Monsters by clicking the link in the description. For all of you that are here with us today, if you haven't gotten a copy already, we have some extras up at the register. This is definitely a book that you will want to discuss with all of your friends after you've read it, so I highly recommend buying multiple copies. We also have copies of Brandon's wonderful novel, Real Life, as well. As I mentioned earlier, Claire will be signing and personalizing books. My coworker Alexa is going to point right now to where that will be happening. It's a little bit hidden, so it'll all make sense in a little bit. We ask that you all line up down the center aisle, curve around to the side. Please make sure that you grab all of your personal belongings with you and those pens that were on your chairs. Our books are magic pens, so please don't slip them into your pockets. You don't want to be the person stealing from an indie bookstore. You can buy them if you really want to. All right, that's all. Let's give these two one last round of applause.